Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. All right, cool. So, I went ahead and took a game from the 2019 Grand Chess Tour that they played in Croatia, and it is Wesley versus Hikaru Nakamura. So, for all of my people that are coming from the Philippines, magandang umaga, kumusta, aking magakabagan, maayong buntag, or magandang hapon, or maayong hapon. Kamusta to you guys. Akong Magahagala for all my people that speak Cebuano and speak Tagalog. Hopefully, I cover the major languages and stuff that come from the Philippines. But I appreciate you guys checking my video out very much. Well, if you guys are ready, we just have English and Cebuano and Tagalog. Yeah, if you guys are ready to go, let's go ahead and take a look and see what we have for this game. Now, this is taken from round 8 of that tournament. I'm honestly, as I'm sitting here, not sure who won that. Somebody's gonna probably question that and be like, well, "Who won?" I'm like, I don't know. I just went and grabbed the game. Make sure my yeah, bam, up. Okay, cool. All right, if you guys are ready, let's go ahead and take a look, see what we have for the game. All right, so we got E4. We have E5, knight to F3, knight comes to C6, bishop to B5. As you guys know, one of the oldest openings of play in the game of chess. Been studied all the way back to the late 1400s. We got knight to F6, so we have the Berlin. We have castles by white. And of course, as I always say, knight takes E4 is not giving away a pawn. You do see rook to E1, knight comes to D6. This is one of the main lines as well, knight takes E5. A lot of times you'll see, the queen swap type line where the bishop will take here, pawn will take, wait, do you have... Actually, you have D4 first, then knight to D6. Bishop takes, pawn takes, knocks the knight over here to F5, and then we have that queen swap line. Many different ways to play. It's pretty solid. Even though you are, queen swapping and knocking your king off of its castling privileges, you're definitely not lost. But in this particular game, we have rook to E1, knight comes to D6, and then we just immediately take the pawn with knight takes E5. We got bishop to E7. We have bishop back to F1. We have to be careful that we're not obstructing our view of this knight. And we don't want to do something like this, kind of blocking our pawns and stuff like that. So bishop to F1 is actually a very legitimate retreat. The knight comes to F5. We see knight to F3. We got D5, D4. We have castles by black. And it is in this position that we have the novelty of the game. I'm sure you guys probably can't guess this move because it's like really, really super computer. Knight C3. I'm just messing with y'all. Knight to C3 is like probably one of the most natural moves in the position. You're just simply developing your knight. So I feel like everybody out there would have gotten that move. It's not a rocket science move. You're just literally just taking the principles and developing your piece. So it's a pretty easy novelty to find, I think. But yeah, so as crazy as it sounds, we do have a brand new game in this position here. It's kind of interesting when you see like these natural developing moves that end up being novelties because they just seem like they're just so natural that somebody would have had to have played them. But I mean, when I looked at it as of 2019, this is a novelty position. And it's possible that this knight to F5 move here does kind of knock it off into novelty land because the knight is not attacked on D6. So, So anyway, like I said, we have knight to C3. Then we have knight to H4, trying to get rid of this knight here. We don't want it to be subject to a double pin because it's going to be kind of annoying. So we trade here on H4, knight takes H4, bishop takes H4. We got bishop to B5. We got knight to E7, bishop down to D3. We got bishop up to F6. And then we have a nice little checkmate threat. Of course, if black falls asleep, we might see something like B6, and then that's checkmate in 1. But these guys are a little bit too highly rated for that. So Hikaru Nakamura doesn't fall asleep. He goes back and he plays G6. We see queen coming back to F3. And if you guys want to go ahead and stop the video and see, I'm going to actually give you guys two different moves that are fairly equal. but they are both very legitimate moves to play in this position. There's a specific type of retreat idea that you have to kind of have in your mind when you play either one of the moves. So if you guys want to go ahead and stop the video real quick and see if you can find what two moves are good in this position, go ahead. I'll show you which was played in the game and which was also a legitimate move here too. All right, cool. So the move that was played. So if you guess either of these two moves, you have the right idea behind your thinking. The move that was actually played in the game is Bishop to G7, it's a very legitimate move. As you guys know, these squares can be very weak around the king when you've done this fianchetto situation there, and so you definitely want to preserve this bishop as much as possible. But there might have been some of you guys that would have been thinking about actually just taking here on D4. That is actually a very legitimate move as well. But you have to have a little bit of care when you do make this particular move, because you have to remember what I just said a second ago as far as your dark squares being weak around your king. So after knight to B5, the bishop would have to retreat back to G7. Or even it's possible, I'm not completely sure, to go back to H8. I'm not really sure why you would do that though. It kind of restricts your king's movement. But you do maintain, some strength, around your king. So you would see something like bishop to F4. Bishop would come to F5. You might see bishop to G5 trying to, obstruct this bishop's movement. Of course, you're threatening this knight here. After F6, you see bishop coming back to F4. The whole point behind it is, yeah, you are giving up this pawn, but you are targeting a nice pawn, a weak pawn in black's position as well. So you're going to get your pawn back. Bishop would probably take on D3. You see queen taking D3. Now, the one little side variation I do want to talk about, like I said, you do have to have, if you immediately go back to G7, you pretty much already have the thought. But if you do take on D4, and then after knight to B5, you don't have the right concept of going back to G7, and you do want to try to preserve that pawn by going back to B6. This would be very horribly losing. And like I said, it centers around the fact that your dark squares are weak around your king. So you'd see bishop to H6. And if you didn't give up the exchange, you actually move rook to E8. This would be completely losing after queen to F6. And it is almost impossible to prevent mate. I actually think this is a mate in 5. The knight would come to F5, which is your only try to prevent the checkmate on G7. The bishop would take. You're not worried about your queen getting taken because that would just be mate in 1 this way. The rook would take on E1. You basically have to start giving up the kitchen sink. Rook would take on E1. Bishop would take on F2. King would take on F2. Queen would come to F8, but there's not really anything else. Like I said, I mean, the queen taking on F6 is just going to be dropping mate in 1. So, you have to have the right ideas behind your thoughts and understanding the structure that you're playing to make sure that you don't get into stuff like this. So, like I said, bishop going back to G7 was correct, and then bishop taking on D4 was also correct, but you have to make sure that you do the correct retreat. So, like I said, bishop to G7 was played in the game. We see bishop to G5, pawn to F6, bishop down to D2, and then we have C6, and now you can see that weakness is no longer relevant. We go knight to E2, the knight comes to F5, we have G3, knight to H6, we have C4, trying to get this diagonal open for this bishop. Of course, when you have two bishops, you're trying to open the position as much as possible so that you're, you just maximize the effectiveness of your bishop. So we see bishop to G4, knocking the queen away, fianchetto into queen, and then we see pawn takes C4, bishop takes C4 with check. The king moves over to H8. We see D5, knight to F7. We see F4, knight comes to E5. We see bishop to E2. Bishop to D7, and then we see rook A to D1. And you want to be careful in this position because it might seem like you can just force the trade of the bishop with knight to E6. But the main problem that you have in your particular situation is the fact that this bishop is undefended here on D2. So it seems juicy, but after bishop takes E6, pawn takes E6, the queen would be taken on D2, and that idea kind of exploded. So the first thing you would probably want to do is move bishop to b4 first. You know, putting a tempo on the rook, and then after that, you can actually try to create a passed pawn here, which is actually pretty strong here. But going back, like I said, we did have rook a to d1. It's always good because you anticipate at some point this file is going to be opening, so you have your rooks, you know, poised and ready to go. So we see pawn takes d5, bishop to c3, bishop to c6, knight takes on d5. It's a nice central knight. We see f5. F5 is really legit. I mean, it's opening up this bishop on this long diagonal and kind of contesting this one here on c3. So we see f4. The knight comes back to d7. Also, another nice move was knight to g4. And then after trades, you know, we're taken care of here. But this is pretty good for black. It's kind of restricting the movement that white has on their king side with their pawns. Which is, you know, something else you could have did. So knight comes to d7. We see bishop takes g7 with check. King takes g7. Bishop to f3. Now we have, like, you know, a very cemented knight in the middle of the board. You know, very heavily protected with the queen and the rook and all of that and the bishop. So the knight comes to f6. We see knight takes f6. Queen takes f6. Bishop takes c6. Pawn takes c6. And then we see rook to d7 with check. The rook comes to f7, and then we have the very accurate queen to d2. And then rook takes d7, queen takes d7. We have king to f8, and then we have rook to e5. This is a really nice move because you do have to recognize as white that you do have some weaknesses here on the queen side with your pawns. So you don't want the rook and the queen to be able to start, you know, trying to, you know, snap away at that. And of course, you know, you can't go b3. Actually, you could. You're going to be looking at this here. So that's going to be knocking the queen. So it's just going to be a little bit more complicated than you like. So rook to e5 really nicely cuts off that queen influence on that queen side. So we see rook to d8. The queen takes on h7. Also possible is queen taking a7. Pretty much the same deal. But we see queen takes h7. We see rook to e8. Queen to h6 with check. We got king to f7. We have queen to h7 with check. King comes to f8, and then we see queen to c7, and then we see rook takes e5, queen takes e5, queen takes e5, pawn takes e5. Now, something that was actually a little bit more accurate after rook to e5 was actually going to be taken with the pawn. And this actually gets you a little bit more material because after queen to e7, you would see queen to take c6. Queen takes e5, and then the queen takes g6. And as you can see, you're up, you know, quite a bit of pawns. You're gonna have to parry some checks because after something like this, you know, you're a little bit weak here, but you do have a completely passed pawn here that has some good prospects. But like I said, we did see pawn takes e5, king to f7. We have h4, king to e6, king to f2, king takes e5, king to f3. We see c5, b3, king to e6, king to f4, king to f6. We have a3, we have a6, we have b4, and c coming. So we have the pawn coming to c4, a4, and as long as something I want you guys to notice is this king is maintaining the square of this pawn at the moment. So you have the ability to push that a4. So the king comes to e6. We come down to e3 with the king. King comes to d5, king to d2. We have king to d4, king to c2, c3, and then we have b5. And it is actually in this position that Hikaru Nakamura does resign the game. If we just look at two different continuations here as to the reason why he resigned the game. One of the main possibilities is actually going to be taking the pawn here on b5. But after pawn takes b5, you're going to see king to c5. The king would take on c3, and then the king would take on b5. And in this position, everything is completely equal. But now the white king has the ability to shoulder the black king away from effectively defending his pawns here, and also to try to come and influence and capture these pawns here. So the move here is going to be king to d4. And then as you guys can see, you know, you don't have really a direct way to start trying to come over to the king side. So this king is effectively shouldering this king away, you know, up or around and down. So the king comes to c6, after king to e5, king to d7, king to f6. As you guys can see, these pawns are going to be dropping. And then you just have two completely connected passed pawns. And this king is not going to be able to come over and get into the corner to try to see if he can get some type of draw. Also, if you were to try to avoid the capture and maybe go king to c5, you would actually be able to push the king really, really far over into the top queen side corner. After pawn takes a6, king takes a6, you have a7. The king takes a7. This is like the maximum that you can force the king over. And then you're just going to be able to scoop the pawn here. And the problem with this situation is the king has to remain kind of in this vicinity because this pawn can just run and queen if it's, if it's deserted too far. So, you see king coming down to a6 and then king to d4. It's more of the same, but with this king being way over here. So in light of that, I mean, this is something that both of these players can just, quickly calculate that they're going to be running into this type of endgame. And that's why Hikaru Nakamura, being the G that he is, went ahead and resigned the game. So yeah, that is that game. Appreciate you guys coming by. Maraming salamat po sa nanonood ng aking mga video. Kamusta to you guys. Mabuhay ingat lagi to you guys. Appreciate everybody coming by and taking a look at my video. And I will see you guys next time. All right.